4 days. That is how long 16 American soldiers held on inside enemy territory that the United States government officially claimed no American soldier had entered. 4 days of combat inside Laos, a country where, according to every public statement Washington had made, no special forces units were operating. 4 days of wounded men, dwindling ammunition, and close air support that was the only thing standing between them and complete destruction. Captain Eugene McCarley understood the mission before the helicopters lifted off. What he didn't know, on the morning of September 11, 1970, was that he wouldn't sleep again for 96 hours. McCarley was 32 years old, a Green Beret officer with Command and Control South, CCS, the most classified element of MACV-SOG, the Pentagon's clandestine arm-running missions that Congress hadn't authorized and the American public would never be told about. He was the kind of officer who understood, at a bone-deep level, that sometimes the mission and the stated rules of engagement pointed in completely opposite directions. Tucked in his breast pocket was a folded paper outlining Tailwind's objectives, a paper that officially didn't exist. He'd been told that clearly before liftoff. If they went down in Laos, there would be no rescue mission, no acknowledgment. His family would receive the standard notification, and the cause of death would be something other than the truth. What McCarley couldn't know, standing on the Kontum tarmac before liftoff, was that the NVA base area they were about to penetrate wasn't a rear echelon logistics depot. It was something considerably more dangerous, and the commander holding that ground had been watching American insertion patterns for years. If you're watching this, you already understand that the real history of Vietnam doesn't live in Pentagon briefings or congressional testimony. It lives in classified after-action reports that took decades to surface, and in the memories of men who were told to forget. This channel exists to tell those stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices these men faced. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let them disappear into the footnotes Washington always preferred.
McCarley grew up understanding duty as something that ran in the blood rather than arrived through argument. His father had served in Korea, come home quieter than he left, and never talked about what he'd witnessed, only that it had mattered, and that mattering was enough. Eugene enlisted young, moved through conventional Army assignments with the methodical competence that attracts the right kind of attention, and earned his Green Beret after a selection process designed to strip away everything except what's essential. By the time he reached MACV-SOG, he had already developed the quality that clandestine operations required above all others: the ability to make consequential decisions without guidance, without confirmation, without the luxury of knowing whether the choice was right until it was far too late to change it. He carried two things into every mission. The first was a photograph, his wife, taken on the front porch of their house in the summer of '68, the year everything in America seemed to be burning except their particular corner of it. She was smiling at something outside the frame. He'd carried that photograph through 3 previous deployments. The corners creased now, the paper worn soft from being folded and unfolded in the dark during the long watches when the mind needed something solid to hold. The second thing he carried was a promise, a private covenant that had nothing to do with operational objectives. Every man who went in with him came out with him. Nobody got left. It was not a tactical plan. It was a statement about who he intended to be when this was finished. MACV-SOG had changed him in ways that conventional service hadn't prepared him for. In a regular unit, you operated inside acknowledged reality. Your unit had a designation, your mission existed in records, your casualties would be reported and mourned officially. In SOG, nothing existed. Operations ran in countries the United States was not at war with, by methods that would have generated congressional investigations if anyone could have proven they happened. McCarley had run cross-border missions before Tailwind. He knew the mathematics of deniability intimately. He also knew its cost, and the cost was never paid by the officers who drafted orders in air-conditioned offices in Saigon. It was paid always by the men on the ground. His Montagnard CIDG fighters, the indigenous Highland people who had been fighting alongside American Special Forces since the early 1960s, were men he trusted with his life and could never adequately repay. They had no official status in any of the agreements governing the war. They received none of the recognition and most of the risk. They were loyal beyond any contract, skilled beyond what their lack of formal military record suggested, and brave in a way that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with the specific men standing beside them. They would die in a war that would never officially record their names, fighting for an alliance that was already being quietly dismantled in negotiations neither they nor McCarley were authorized to know about. By the fall of 1970, Nixon's public policy was Vietnamization. The drawdown of American forces, the transfer of combat responsibility, the carefully managed narrative of a war approaching conclusion. The private reality was more complicated. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained the unsolved central problem. Every American killed in the South was killed by something that came down through Laos or Cambodia. Command and Control South continued its cross-border operations as a complement to the withdrawal, keeping pressure on supply routes while conventional forces stepped back. In the Chavane district of southern Laos, NVA forces were consolidating a base area complex that threatened ongoing reconnaissance operations and represented a forward staging element for future pushes into the south. The Tailwind planning assigned the mission dual significance: strike the Chavane complex, disrupt NVA logistics, and divert enemy attention during a critical operational window connected to something larger being prepared in the north. Something McCarley had not been fully briefed on and did not ask about. 16 Americans, approximately 110 Montagnard fighters, no possibility of ground reinforcement, complete dependence on air support for survival once contact became serious. The intelligence assessed the risk as acceptable. McCarley had kept his promise twice before, on smaller operations, against less prepared enemies, where the odds were tilted less severely against him. Now, reading the intelligence package on Chavane, he felt the first real pressure of doubt. Not about whether to go, about whether the promise was one he had the power to keep. He tucked the feeling away and said nothing to anyone. Stories like McCarley's don't survive in official records. They survive because someone decides they matter enough to pass forward. If you served in special forces, in Vietnam, in any of the shadow wars running alongside the one the public could see, the comment section below isn't a place to type. It's where the record gets corrected. Add what you know. Add what you carried home. If your family's history runs through these years in ways that were never officially acknowledged, share it. These stories belong to the people who lived them, not to the classification systems that tried to contain them. The NVA officer commanding the Chavane district base area had spent 4 years in southern Laos, and those years had taught him things no military manual contained. He had observed American SOG operations from the receiving end long enough to recognize their patterns. The distinctive approach corridors used by the South Vietnamese King Bee pilots, the timing signatures separating a reconnaissance insertion from a strike force, the subtle behavioral differences that indicated how many men were aboard and how they intended to deploy. He had been cataloging these observations for months, building a picture of American operational rhythm in his sector. He was not a man who could be surprised by a hatchet force insertion. He had been anticipating one. His forces outnumbered the incoming American element by ratios that would have been decisive in any conventional engagement. The terrain was entirely his, highland jungle that his soldiers had mapped on foot while McCarley's men were still being briefed at Quantum. His supply lines were secure, his defensive positions prepared, his soldiers rested, and operating on familiar ground in a country where they faced no legal accountability and no political ceiling on their response. From every measurable angle, the operational calculus favored him. He was not wrong to feel that. What he shared with McCarley across everything that separated them, uniform, flag, ideology, language, was the weight of command. The particular gravity of knowing that the decisions made in the coming hours would be paid for by men who had trusted someone else with their lives. His soldiers were not abstractions. Many of them were young men who had marched the length of the trail from the north. Weeks of jungle travel, American air attacks, the particular misery of the Ho Chi Minh corridor, to reach this position. They were far from home. They had families waiting. They believed in what they were defending. They were professionals who had been fighting for years and were very good at their work. They weren't wrong to believe they were on the correct side of this conflict from where they stood. The ground they defended was their operational area, established through years of patient effort. The cause, Vietnamese unification, the removal of American military presence from Southeast Asia, had a coherence and legitimacy that the men who held it experienced as moral clarity. War rarely produces a side that is wrong about everything. Most often it produces two sides that are right about different things and catastrophically wrong about whether those things are worth the cost they demand. For McCarley, the stakes extended in layers that the mission briefing couldn't fully map. At the immediate level, 126 lives under his operational responsibility. At the tactical level, penetrate and strike the Chavane complex, force NVA commitment of attention and resources, generate disruption that would ripple through their logistics for weeks. At the strategic level, something larger, he hadn't been fully briefed on, connected to operations being planned simultaneously to the north, requiring a specific operational window to remain open. He understood enough to know the mission mattered beyond its immediate objectives. He also understood enough to know that if his force was destroyed in Laos, the political management would consist of denying his force had been there at all. There was a particular quality to that equation that he carried without naming. If they failed, the government would deny them. If they succeeded, the government would classify them. Either outcome produced the same public result. Nothing. The men who did the work would receive no public acknowledgment, no commendation that could be shown to their families, no place in any official history accessible to the people who mattered. The Montagnard fighters who would carry a disproportionate share of the risk would receive even less. They were fighting for an alliance that America was already quietly beginning to unwind. What the mission planning had not fully modeled was the specific decision the NVA commander would make when his intelligence confirmed that a hatchet force was inbound. The expected response was defensive consolidation, pull forces into prepared positions, protect the base area, force the Americans to fight uphill toward fortified ground. The more dangerous response, the one that could transform a 4-day raid into a 4-day survival operation, was pursuit. Encirclement. Not holding ground but closing distance. and never letting the Americans disengage long enough to reach the extraction point. That distinction would determine everything about how the next 96 hours unfolded. If you're still watching, you understand something most people never consider. Military history isn't about celebrating conflict. It's about being honest with the people who fought it, and honest about the decisions that sent them. Subscribe and join those who refuse to let these stories become footnotes. Hit the like button. It tells YouTube's algorithm that content like this deserves to reach veterans, families, and everyone who believes the truth is worth more than a comfortable official version. These men earned at least that much. The King B helicopters came in low and fast, below the canopy line where terrain permitted, the rotors cutting through air already dense with early morning humidity. McCarley felt the landing skids make contact with Laotian soil before his mind fully registered the transition. The aircraft had barely settled when he was moving, the weight of his ruck and his weapon pressing through the soles of his boots into ground that officially didn't contain him. The earth here was different from the red clay around Kontum. Darker, denser, carrying the smell of something old and organic. The particular rot of a forest floor undisturbed for years. His hands found the grip of his Car-15 without conscious direction. Around him, his Montagnard fighters moved with the fluid silence of men who had been doing this their entire adult lives, disappearing into the tree line as the helicopters pulled away. The rotor noise faded in stages. First the direct sound, then the secondary echoes off the canopy, then a silence that closed down so completely that McCarley could hear his own breathing, the soft movement of his radio operator settling into position 2 meters to his right, the distant call of something in the upper canopy that had been disturbed by the insertion. Then the jungle sounds returned. Insects, water running somewhere below the ridge, the minute rustling of undergrowth in air that barely moved. Nothing human. For 3 minutes they held position and listened. McCarley had learned that if contact was coming immediately, those first 3 minutes would signal it. The jungle had its own warning system, and the absence of normal sound was as informative as any intelligence brief. On the 4th minute, movement. Not sound, movement. A shift in the quality of shadow 60 meters to the northeast, the kind of visual displacement the eye catches before the mind names it. McCarley's hand signal stopped the column. His point man, a Montagnard sergeant named Keepa, 26 years old from a village in the central highlands, had already gone flat. Keepa had been reading jungle in this manner since childhood. He held up 2 fingers, then 4, then moved his hand in a slow, deliberate arc. Not a patrol, a fixed position, a perimeter. The wind shifted. McCarley smelled it then. Wood smoke and cooking oil, the signature of a base area occupied and active. Close, significantly closer than the intelligence had indicated the nearest NVA element should be. The mission briefing had placed the outer perimeter of the Chavane complex 2 kilometers to the northwest. What he was smelling was within 500 meters, which meant either the intelligence was wrong about the layout or the NVA had extended their defensive perimeter substantially in the days since the last reconnaissance overflight. Either possibility carried the same tactical implication. They had inserted directly into the enemy's outer security zone. He held a slow breath and tasted it. The metallic thinness at the back of the throat that comes when a body processes adrenaline faster than it can absorb it. The particular flavor of a situation that has already shifted from planned to improvised. He'd tasted it before. Every time the gap opened between the briefing and the ground, between what intelligence promised and what terrain delivered. He swallowed it, signaled Keepa forward, and began adjusting the column's axis of movement. 300 meters to the northeast, an NVA sergeant commanding a forward listening post completed his own calculation. He had heard the helicopters on approach and tracked the insertion point. It was exactly where his commander's pattern analysis had predicted. He had 45 seconds to decide: initiate contact now and alert the garrison, or shadow the American element and allow it to move deeper, where the encirclement elements were already beginning their arc. He let them pass. His radio transmission was brief. His commander's response was briefer. The NVA commander began the movement that would define the next 4 days, not a defensive consolidation, a closing motion, 3 separate elements beginning to arc through jungle they knew without maps, without noise, with the patience of men who understood that time was on their side, and the Americans were already inside the ring. Contact hit at 11:47, 90 minutes after insertion. Not from the direction McCarley had posted flank security, from the south, the direction the helicopters had approached from, the direction that should have been clear. The first indication was KPA dropping flat and AK fire cutting through the canopy above the column. Then an RPG. Then the layered noise of a close-range ambush initiated by men who had chosen their ground and their moment with care. McCarley's training compressed the next 60 seconds into something manageable. Fire and movement, use the terrain, locate the flanks, identify the casualties, get the command element to defensible high ground. He was moving before he finished the thought, reorganizing the column into a perimeter on the nearest ridge, calling for immediate close air support on the frequency that was his one reliable connection to survival. The first A-1 Sky Raider arrived 16 minutes later. 16 minutes of continuous contact that cost 3 Montagnard fighters killed and 7 wounded before the situation stabilized enough to begin a real assessment. And then McCarley understood what the NVA commander had been doing for 3 weeks before Tailwind's insertion. He hadn't been preparing defensive positions. He had been preparing a hunt. The base area wasn't an administrative installation. It was a defended complex with multiple mutually supporting positions, reinforced beyond what any reconnaissance had captured, with elements already in motion to close the exits. The intelligence had missed not just the size, but the fundamental nature of what was here. They had been inserted into the center of something the mission planning had not accounted for, and the ring was closing. But that was only the beginning. By the second morning, the encirclement had not closed. The air support, continuous, costly, and sustained by a forward air controller who had effectively made the Tailwind position his personal operational priority, had broken 3 separate ground efforts to close the ring. McCarley's force held a ridgeline with defensible terrain and enough clearance for emergency extraction. The wounded from the first day's contact had been pulled out under fire the previous evening. 11 Montagnard fighters killed in the first 24 hours, 2 Americans seriously wounded and extracted. The mission's disruptive objective was being accomplished in the most direct possible way. The NVA was committing every available element in the Chavane district to dealing with 16 Americans and their Montagnard fighters, which left those elements unavailable for anything else. It was a brutal and unplanned form of mission success. In the brief stillness before dawn on the 12th of September, while his radio operator managed the air support frequencies and his senior NCO walked the perimeter, McCarley found a moment. He took the photograph from his breast pocket. In the darkness, it was indistinguishable, just soft paper with creased edges, an image that required memory to complete. He held it without looking at it. Somewhere behind him, across the international border that officially he had not crossed, in a country that officially contained him, a woman was either asleep or awake, trusting or testing the particular instinct that knows something without being told. He put the photograph back. He had work to do. The promise was intact. Everyone accounted for. The Montagnard dead. He knew each of them by name, by position, by the specific way each had moved and worked, were being carried. The promise didn't specify the condition of the men who came out. It specified that they came out. It was holding at a cost that the man who made the promise had not fully calculated when he made it. The crisis arrived on the afternoon of the 13th. A Montagnard element holding the southern edge of the perimeter reported contact with an NVA force that had worked its way around the ridgeline's eastern approach, a route the defensive plan had assessed as covered by terrain too steep for quick movement. The assessment had been wrong. The NVA element was now within 150 meters of the perimeter's most exposed point, and it was not moving alone. A second element was pressing from the north, coordinated. Two simultaneous probes. One perimeter, insufficient men to hold both points at full strength without stripping the third side, the side facing the extraction landing zone. The decision was stark. Reinforce both threatened points by pulling men from the LZ sector and risk losing the only exit if the northern probe was a feint designed to thin the LZ before a third element hit it. Or hold the LZ at strength and let the threatened points fight with what they had, accepting the risk that one might fold before air support could shift the pressure. Every option carried a fatal assumption. Every option required knowing something McCarley could not know, what the NVA commander intended to do in the next 15 minutes. 300 meters away, the NVA commander was making the same calculation from the other direction. He understood that the Americans' irreplaceable asset was the radio and the air support it controlled. If he could generate enough simultaneous pressure to force the American commander to commit fully to perimeter defense, the forward air controller above would lose effective ground guidance, and the strikes would become generalized rather than precise. That was the moment to push hard on the LZ. He was distributing his pressure carefully, waiting for the right configuration before giving the final order. What would you do? Not in theory, not at a desk with a map and time to think. Right now, the radio is in your hand. Your men are watching. The NVA is 30 seconds from assault range on two sides simultaneously. Your extraction is directly behind you. You have one decision and you will make it in the next 10 seconds, and it will either preserve your force or end it, and you will not know which until it is already done. There is no one to ask. The manual doesn't cover this specific combination of variables. What do you do? There is no correct answer. There is only what you choose and what it costs, and whether the men who trusted you with their lives are still breathing when the accounting is finished. McCarley pulled one element, half, not all, from the eastern perimeter reinforcement and repositioned it to thicken the LZ sector. He was betting that the northern probe was the feint and the eastern approach was the main effort. He called the forward air controller and gave coordinates for suppression of the eastern tree line. He told his senior NCO to hold the southern point with what it had. He keyed the handset and held the position. He had promised himself, and in the way that such things transmit without being spoken, every man with him, that nobody got left behind. The promise had been made in the belief that the right choices would remain available. Now he understood what his father had understood after Korea and never named directly. The promise doesn't change when the situation becomes impossible. What changes is the price of keeping it. The choice was made. The consequences were just beginning. The shift came from above, literally from above, in the form of additional air assets that CCS had managed to divert to the tailwind frequency over the objections of other operational commands that needed them elsewhere. The A-1 Sky Raiders sustaining the mission since insertion were approaching their ordnance limits. What arrived on the afternoon of the 13th were aircraft with heavier payloads, better station time, and the fuel margins to remain responsive through extended contact cycles. More consequentially, a forward air controller familiar with the Chavane district's specific terrain came on frequency. A pilot who had flown reconnaissance over this area for months and understood exactly how the ridgeline's topography would force NVA elements to mass before any assault, and where that massing would occur. The intelligence he provided, cross-referenced with what McCarley's perimeter observers had been reporting, gave the force something it had lacked since insertion: an accurate picture of where the NVA elements actually were, not where the original briefing had estimated them to be. 3 major concentration points, all within effective strike range, all positioned in terrain corridors that the enemy had relied upon correctly as providing cover from generalized air attack, and which the new controller's terrain knowledge could now address with precision. McCarley reorganized. Under continuous contact with wounded men and reduced ammunition, he restructured his defensive sectors to match the corrected picture, thickening the 2 genuinely threatened points, pulling back from a third position that air coverage could now hold without requiring ground presence, concentrating what he had where it would matter most. It was the kind of adjustment that appears obvious in retrospect and is nearly impossible to execute in real time, when the noise is constant and the information is incomplete, and every decision is made against a countdown that no one is announcing but everyone can feel. His NCOs executed it without breaking cohesion. The Montagnard fighters, people who had been fighting in this style of war for longer than many of them had been adults, who understood jungle contact with a specificity that no training program could replicate, moved with a discipline and adaptability that McCarley could not describe adequately in any after-action document. Not because the words didn't exist, but because the report would be classified and the people who deserved to understand what these men had done would never read it. They fought with the particular focus of men who have finished hoping for a better situation and decided to meet the one they have. It wasn't about firepower, though the air support was the margin between surviving and not. It wasn't about superior equipment or training advantages, though both were real. It was about something harder to measure and impossible to brief. The refusal, sustained across 3 days of continuous contact inside hostile territory, to accept what the situation was indicating about the available outcomes. 16 Americans and their Montagnard partners had been inserted into a prepared position, had fought inside that position for 72 hours, and had not broken. That fact had begun, quietly, to recalculate the NVA commander's operational assessment. He had not expected them to still be here on day 3. His plan had assumed that the American force, once it understood the scale of what it had entered, would attempt immediate extraction and absorb whatever casualties came with pushing toward the LZ under maximum pressure. They had not done that. They had fought from the ridgeline with an aggression and tactical coordination that had cost him considerably more than his projections had allowed for. His forces had expended ammunition and men at rates affecting his operational capacity. The Americans' air support was too accurate and too responsive to the specific ground situation to be degraded by mass contact alone. He made the hardest decision available to a commander who has committed fully, the decision that the objective had become unachievable at acceptable cost, and that the correct move was to manage a disengagement before the losses became operationally significant beyond Chavane. His soldiers had fought with every skill and determination they possessed. They had not achieved encirclement not because of any failure in them, but because the men on that ridgeline had declined at every decision point to make it possible. He would account for it as a strategic disruption. The American force damaged, degraded, driven from its initial insertion area. This was accurate. It was also incomplete. What had actually been decided in the Chavane district on the 13th and 14th of September 1970 was something that appeared in no official record on either side. The stakes assigned to Tailwind, provide operational cover during a critical northern window, demonstrate that NVA base areas in southern Laos were not sanctuary, had been met. Not because the plan had executed as designed, because 30 men held a ridgeline for 3 days and 2 nights against a force that outnumbered them and knew the terrain, and never stopped fighting, and never stopped calling in the strikes, and never gave the encirclement the moment it needed to close. What was at stake had been settled not by strategy or superior resources, but by the specific refusal of specific men to accept the outcome the situation seemed to require. On the morning of September 14th, the extraction helicopters came in under fire. The King Bees took hits on multiple aircraft. The crews, South Vietnamese Air Force pilots who had been flying SOG missions since the program began, men whose courage appears in no official American history, pushed their damaged aircraft into an LZ that was still being contested even as the last men boarded and the skids lifted. Victory came, but the cost was still being counted. The final accounting: 2 Americans killed in action, approximately 33 Montagnard fighters killed, multiple Americans and Montagnard fighters wounded, a significant number seriously enough to require extended care. NVA casualties, assessed through after-action reporting and air damage assessment, were estimated in the hundreds, a figure that would remain classified and contested for decades. Each number on the American and Montagnard side had a name attached to it. Each name had a face that McCarley could place without effort, a position on the perimeter, a sound, a specific detail. The way a man moved through jungle, the particular voice on the radio during the worst hours of the second night, the silhouette of someone who had been beside you in the dark for 4 days and was now permanently gone. Capa, the Montagnard sergeant who had read the jungle in the first minutes after insertion, whose awareness had given the force its only warning before contact, survived. He came out on one of the last helicopters, wounded, having held his position through both major NVA pushes on the southern perimeter. McCarley would never be able to publicly acknowledge what Capa had contributed, because the contribution existed in a mission that didn't officially exist, and Capa's service was in a capacity that no public record would ever name. He returned to the Central Highlands. What followed for him, and for the Montagnard fighters who had served with SOG across the years of the program, as the American withdrawal accelerated, as Vietnamization replaced the alliances that had sustained the Shadow War, as the people who had trusted that alliance found themselves without the backing they had been promised, is a separate accounting, a heavier one that the historical record has not yet fully addressed. The extraction LZ smelled of aviation fuel and burned ordnance, a combination that McCarley would never afterward encounter without the specific overlay of memory it carried. The helicopters were loud in a way that felt wrong after 4 days of learning to read every variation in jungle sound. He sat against the interior frame of the King Bee with one hand against his breast pocket, not taking the photograph out, just confirming it was there, while the crew chief scanned the tree line below. nobody spoke. The silence held everything that words would have made smaller. The promise had held. Everyone who came out, the dead included, carried to the LZ, loaded under fire, brought home in a condition that made the word home carry a weight it hadn't carried before the insertion. The promise had cost more than the man who made it had understood it would cost. That was the thing about promises made before contact. They were made by someone who didn't yet know what he was promising. The man who kept them was always slightly different from the man who made them. The NVA soldiers who had fought on and around the Chavane ridgeline carried their own costs out of that engagement. Those who carried anything out at all. The commander who had set the encirclement and watched the Americans refuse to fall into it would file his report and continue the war. His soldiers had fought with skill and conviction in a cause they believed in, against men they had been ordered to destroy, in a country that would become entirely theirs within 5 years. History does not record their individual costs with the same resolution it applies to the American side. But those costs were real. They were paid in the same currency, by men with the same basic human inventory, families, hope, a belief that what they were doing mattered. They were not wrong to hold that belief from where they stood. The folded paper from McCarley's breast pocket, the Tailwind mission orders, was surrendered when the helicopters crossed back into South Vietnamese airspace. Collected by an intelligence officer, classified, placed in a file that would remain sealed for 27 years. The photograph stayed with him. The promise, amended now, carrying 33 names added to its permanent terms, names that would never appear in any public ledger, went home with him too. He had come back. Some of what he had taken into Laos had not. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years, and the weight that Chavane had added to what he carried never got lighter. It became, over time, simply part of the load. The way that sustained weight, when you can't put it down, eventually just becomes the shape of how you move. 27 years after Tailwind, Eugene McCarley was in his late 50s, when the operation he had led in a country that officially hadn't contained him became a matter of public record, not because the government chose to release it, but because a CNN and Time collaborative report in 1998 forced the issue. The report made allegations that the operation had involved sarin gas. Those allegations were false, formally investigated, formally retracted. The retraction did significant damage to the historical record, overshadowing the actual story with a manufactured controversy, while the true account remained underreported and misunderstood. McCarley and other Tailwind veterans gave interviews. They described what had actually happened in the Chavane district in September of 1970. They had been waiting 27 years to say it out loud. Those 27 years had not been uncomplicated. SOG veterans returned from operations they couldn't discuss to a country that didn't know they existed, processed experiences they couldn't explain without violating the secrecy agreements they had signed, sought help for things that officially hadn't happened. You cannot adequately describe to anyone, a counselor, a family member, a friend, what is keeping you awake at 3 in the morning if describing it would require explaining where you were and what you did and why both things are still classified. McCarley moved through those years with the discipline of a man who has learned to carry weight quietly because the alternative, setting it down somewhere it could be seen, was not an option available to him. He had served honorably. The men beside him had served with a courage and skill that deserved recognition that most of them never publicly received. The Montagnard fighters who had been with them, who had carried the mission as much as any American and paid for it at least as heavily, had served with a loyalty that went beyond any contract or obligation anyone had offered them in return. The NVA soldiers on the Chavane ridgeline had also served with honor, in the sense that carries meaning. They did what soldiers do, with discipline and bravery, for a cause they believed in, at a cost they bore without flinching. All of them did what they believed was right. The fault, when there was fault, lay not in any man who fought, but in decisions made far from that ridgeline, by people who would never personally carry the consequences of their choices. The soldiers did their part. Whether the leaders did theirs is a question the historical record leaves open. War produces heroes on both sides. It produces tragedies on both sides. The courage of the men on the Chavane ridgeline, on either side, does not diminish the courage of those facing them. Both things are true simultaneously. Both deserve to be remembered. The Montagnard fighters who served throughout the SOG program, who have no monument and occupy no official history accessible to the American public, deserve the same acknowledgment as the Americans they fought beside. Their sacrifice was real. The alliance that left them deserves a separate and honest accounting. The photograph survived all of it. Worn at the edges now, the image faded over decades to something that required memory to complete. A woman on a porch in the summer of '68, smiling at something outside the frame. He still carried it. The promise had been kept at the cost that keeping it required, and the weight of those 33 names added to its terms never left him. But it had become, over time, something he knew how to hold. That is what soldiers learn to do with the things that cannot be set down. Not to carry them lightly, but to carry them with intention. We were never there, the official record said for 27 years. They were. They are. Their service was real. Their sacrifice was real. The fault, when there was fault, lay in strategy and policy, in decisions made by people with the luxury of distance, never in the men who went in. Honor the warriors, question the wars. If you served or knew someone who served, in the light or in the shadow of a war that official history was slow to acknowledge, their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to let these men disappear into sealed archives. Share this story if you believe they deserved more than 27 years of silence. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars,